So what I'm going to talk about is the intersection of big data and work, and a lot of the different ways that data mining is starting to affect our careers, specifically the way algorithms being used by companies that are actually completely outside of your employers and completely outside of your own control are affecting work and career. So as an example, you can ask, why am I specifically here? How did the Be Digital Global Congress decide to invite me here to be a keynote speaker? And one of the reasons is that a Forbes.com blogger, Hayden Shaughnessy, did a post of like the top 10 or 20 big data influencers a couple years ago. And I was number 3 on the list. I used to work for SiliconANGLE, so that's why that's my employer there. So that, that's traveled around the web. Now there's this whole article that says, Klint Finley, he's a big influencer on this subject. But how did Hayden Shaughnessy decide that I was an influencer? He used a tool called TrackR, and you'll actually be hearing from TrackR on Friday. They're the keynote speaker on Friday, to automatically generate a list of influencers based off of social media data. So I don't know exactly how it works. It's sort of a black box, but apparently, they gather tweets, Facebook messages, that sort of thing, and look and see what you're tweeting about, what you're writing about on Facebook, and how people are responding to it, and how many people are commenting on it, how many people are liking it, how many people are retweeting it. And using that, they're able to determine how influential you are, or at least in theory, because to be completely honest with you, I don't think I'm being modest when I say I don't really think that I deserve to be number 3 on this list. For example, Derek Harris, who you just heard from GigaOM, wasn't on the list at all. So I don't know if I even should have been on the top 20. But I don't know that anyone suffered because I was listed high on this list. But it doesn't seem like it was a very fair list. I think that there were some problems with it that made certain people, me in particular, out to be a little bit more influential than we really were. But, and this is an interesting thing about big data and about algorithms, is that once you start to believe something, it becomes true. So now here I am at a conference, getting all these opportunities to speak to media and kind of advance my career based off this notion that I'm influential. So I have become more influential as a result of being called influential. So there's a sort of interesting feedback loop there. So now let's just step back a little bit and talk a little bit about what big data actually is, because I'm sure you've heard a bunch of definitions over the day about what it is, but I figure I should make sure that I'm clear about what I'm talking about. So I try to think of big data as referring to the difficulty of the problem or the size of the problem, as in it's a big data problem, as opposed to being about the size of a data set. So it's not about the amount of data, it's about the difficulty of working with that data. I think this is a revisionist definition. I think the original definition involved, petabyte level data sets, but the way it's come to be used over the past few years is to refer actually to problems that might actually have very small amounts of data but be very difficult to solve. So what makes a problem big, a data problem big? There's a few things. So obviously, as it was originally coined to refer to very large data sets. So companies like Amazon.com that have vast amounts of e-commerce information, Google that has a huge amount of search data, Facebook that knows all sorts of things about relationships between different people. They have huge data sets. They have huge problems because of that. But it can also refer to fast or real-time data, where data is being received faster than it can actually be written to disk. Algorithmic traders are dealing with data at really fast speeds. Twitter has an enormous amount of stuff coming to them really quickly all the time. And you could also think about things like traffic patterns that you want to have in real time, very quickly updated. And the other big problem with data is when you have unstructured or multi-structured data. Facebook is one of the original companies dealing with that. Clout, who I'll talk about a little bit later, who analyzed Twitter and Facebook data, and the NSA, who we've been hearing a lot about over the last few days. They're receiving data actually from places like Facebook, AOL, Google, and so the issue is that they have data coming from lots of different places. It's structured in different ways, or it might not even be structured at all. So trying to run a normal search query on data that has, you know, a whole bunch of different structures is actually really difficult, or it used to be more difficult before we had some of the big data tools that we have now. So why is big data an issue today? You know, why wasn't this an issue 20 years ago? We had the internet 20 years ago. We had computers 20 years ago. I would argue that a big part of it is cheaper storage. Hard drives are much cheaper. Solid-state hard drives have become cheaper, and if you use a solid-state hard drive, it cuts down on your electrical costs, etc. Scale-out architecture, which is basically a fancy way of talking about using a large number of smaller servers, commodity servers, cheap servers, connecting them together to solve a problem instead of buying a supercomputer or a mainframe. Hadoop is the most famous example of that. It's actually an open source clone of what Google used internally a few years ago. And then there's just more data coming in. And that's actually sort of a feedback loop from the first two things. Because now that we can store and analyze more data, we are saving more data. And the more data we save, the more we want to use cheaper storage, and the more we want to use Hadoop because we have the data coming in. So that sets the stage for or what all this is. And the increased numbers of data, where is it coming from? E-commerce, I mentioned Amazon.com already. Here in Spain, obviously Zara is collecting a lot of that sort of information. You'll hear a lot more about e-commerce over the next couple of days, so I'm not going to talk much about that. Mobile phones, Telefonica talked about that this morning, which was really interesting. Lots of information being generated by phones and being stored. I keep coming back to social media, and I will keep coming back to that. Social media obviously is bringing in a large amount of data, and then data exhaust, which is a byproduct actually of all of those first three examples. Data exhaust is sort of the unintended data that comes out of data that's collected. For example, when you enter something onto Twitter, you write your status update. And so you would think of that as being your core data, the thing that you just typed and hit enter and sent it off into the internet. But there's a whole bunch of other information that's included with that, of metadata, for example, the time that you entered it, the location that geographically that you were when you entered that status update, and possibly whether that was a negative tweet or a positive tweet regarding a company is something that's not actually automatically created, but that could be mined out of that data later. So data exhaust is this sort of cumulative collection of data around a particular entry. And that's where we get a lot of potential interesting things to do with big data. How does all that tie back to the theme of work? Well, we are able to use this data to analyze what people are doing all day, whether they're doing it effectively, and that sort of thing. Now, trying to measure the worth of an employee, for example, or measure whether they're doing their jobs at all is it's an ancient problem. It goes back to the beginnings of wages and probably actually even further than that. But we can trace the origins of modern management science to Frederick Taylor's book in 1899, The Principles of Scientific Management. And it was always a flawed premise, but it's still pretty largely accepted in many industries. And what Taylor used to try to do is determine how long a task should take, and then make sure all the workers are completing those tasks within that amount of time. And the thing is that he would try to do that by watching a group of workers work as hard as they could for 1 hour, and then he would deduct 40% from that, sort of on the principle that sometimes they would get tired, they would have to take bathroom breaks, and where did that 40% come from? He just made it up, and that's why it was never completely scientific. He could never actually monitor how much work somebody should specifically be able to do in a day. It's even harder to do that with white-collar work. How many articles should a journalist be able to write per day? How many legal briefs should a lawyer be able to write per day? How many PowerPoint presentations should a manager be able to write in a day? And that answer is going to vary depending on the articles, depending on the briefs, depending on the presentations, and how much other work the manager has to do. So we end up having to just sort of wing it and make it up as we go along based off of our perceptions, our notions of how long something should take or how busy somebody is. But there's not any data to back that up. But now that we can actually monitor what employees do every minute of the day, we can maybe start to get some different ideas about how to do that. One of the issues of trying to quantify the performance of a white-collar worker is the notion of quality. And that's hard for any type of work, but you can make a more objective statement about whether somebody manufactured their widgets correctly or whether they built a table correctly than you can make about whether somebody wrote a brief correctly or wrote an article correctly. So you would historically have, one manager, one supervisor, maybe a few supervisors per employee, and that person has to make the judgment call about whether that employee does good work or not. But in other areas of the economy, we have quote unquote crowdsourced ratings for people. So eBay is a really good example of if you buy something on eBay, you get to rate your seller with a number. And so one person providing feedback on that seller doesn't tell you very much, just like having one manager say, this person does or doesn't do good work doesn't necessarily tell you very much. But if you have hundreds or thousands of people ranking somebody, you start to get a pretty clear picture about whether that seller is actually reputable or reliable. A little bit more controversial would be Yelp, which provides rankings of restaurants and other businesses. Individual people can write a review and give a star-based ranking to any business that's on Yelp. And again, once you start to have tens or hundreds of reviews and rankings, you can start to get a better idea of what the reputation is for that company. To bring that over to workers, there's a car company, car service in the United States called Uber. And so you request a car on your cell phone, the car comes, takes you where you want to go, and afterwards you get to rank your driver on a scale of 1 to 5. If a driver doesn't get good rankings, then Uber just won't assign that driver any more work. So that driver is just automatically selected out of the worker pool. So bringing that into white-collar work, Odesk is an example of a company that lets you hire people for just one-off jobs. For example, I used it to hire a transcriptionist to transcribe my podcasts. Every job that you have somebody do, you get to rank how they did. And since they work for lots of different people, you end up with rankings from lots of different people. So instead of just having one or two supervisors' opinion about a transcriptionist, you have potentially 100 people's opinion about that transcriptionist. And if their work starts to suffer, then their ranking will presumably go down. So there's a real possibility here of people being naturally selected out of the work pool. If you're on Odesk and you start getting bad rankings there, no one's probably going to hire you. If that's your livelihood, then you're going to have to find something else to do for work. So Malik from GigaOM has described this as data Darwinism. As you collect data, collect rankings from people. Some people are going to lose out automatically. So in some cases that might be a good thing, but if it's happening unfairly, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, if it's happening unfairly, then we've got something to be really concerned about. But in the meantime, how could you apply some of the concepts from the reputation economy at places like eBay or Yelp or Odesk to your own company internally? One way is to actually have employees rank each other. So instead of just having the opinion of 1, 2, 3 supervisors, you would have the opinion of all your coworkers who could rank each other anonymously. And I've heard of a few companies doing this. I believe Urban Airship in the US and a company called Coffee and Power do this. And then there's some other things you can do. So Chatter is an internal social network for companies. It's sort of like Facebook for work. 2-3 years ago, Derek Harris, who again you heard from a little while ago, interviewed Mark Benioff at a conference that GigaOM organized, and Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, which owns Chatter, explained that they use Chatter themselves internally, and they actually rank their employees based on how their employees use Chatter. And they actually award bonuses based off of how well they use the internal social network. And Work.com is another company now owned by Salesforce that allows employees to give each other feedback. It used to be called Ripple, and it works on, you can give people badges for accomplishments. So over time, each employee should theoretically accumulate a number of pieces of feedback from their fellow workers, or not, in which case perhaps they're not doing very good work. So that those services and those concepts can start to provide a system for internal reputation in a company. We can extend that out in some other directions by collecting even more data about what people do all day. Because we can now do things that Frederick Taylor could never have dreamed of even being able to do. For example, you can monitor what an employee does every minute of the day. And with video cameras, you could record something that everyone does all day, but then you would have to sit and watch the video and see what somebody did, or have somebody else do it. But now, if you collect it as pieces of data every time somebody performs an action, you can have a computer go through and decide whether that person is being productive or not. So the US Bank in the United States gave location trackers to all their call center workers so they could see where their employees were within the building all day. And call center employees have long been some of the most heavily monitored employees in any sort of workplace, with very precise ideas about how productive or unproductive they were. But then a company called Sociometric Solutions was able to take a lot of that data that was collected from locations, as well as the data that was already being collected on worker productivity, and find some new ways to use that to improve overall worker productivity. For example, they found out that workers who mingle a lot, who talk to each other a lot, are actually more productive than workers who don't talk to each other very often. So they decided to time breaks so that people were going on break at the same time so that they would talk to each other instead of having people go on breaks alone. And there's another company called Evolve that also does a lot of work with call centers in the United States, and they actually found some very similar things. And Evolve also has a service for algorithmically analyzing resumes, CVs. So they can determine based on a number of factors, such as how far an employee lives from the place of work, whether they're likely to work there for a long time. So they can actually now make decisions about who to hire computationally, algorithmically. Deloitte is doing that, is doing something similar but with IT workers and trying to predict what behaviors, or analyzing what behaviors people exhibit when they're about to quit, so that they can get an idea of who is likely to leave their position soon, so that they can try to turn it around and persuade somebody to stay before they've actually made their decision or put in their notice. They can try to understand who's happy and who isn't, again, algorithmically, computationally. So all this sounds pretty interesting so far. It seems like it would be potentially positive things for a business to be able to know who's slacking off, who's working hard, who's productive, who isn't, who's going to quit, which resumes are, whose resumes are good resumes, that sort of thing, all without having to go through all of that alone. And it's extending into some other more disturbing areas. Whole Foods, which is a grocery chain in the US, actually offers employee discounts for food, for groceries, based off of their body fat. So an employee who has low body fat gets cheaper groceries than an employee who has a lot of body fat. So it's an optional thing. They can, you don't have to sign up for this if you work for Whole Foods, but since your employee discount is part of your compensation, basically they're pegging part of your pay to your body fat. So that's a pretty questionable thing to do, but I know this varies from country to country in Europe, but in the US, if you have health insurance at all, it's probably through your employer, and the amount of money it costs your employer depends on how much you actually use your health insurance. And so if your employees are healthier, theoretically your health insurance costs will go down. So that's a pretty big motivator for employers. But this is part of people's private lives. And it's not just Whole Foods now experimenting with this type of program. There's a company called NutriSavings that offers coupons for employees for healthier food, and it actually analyzes whether your groceries are healthy in general, because you use like a card at the grocery store to get your discount. So they actually end up collecting all of this information about employees' eating habits and how healthy they are. Now they anonymize that data so that it doesn't, so that the employers don't actually know this employee is really healthy, this employee is a slob, that sort of thing. They just give the feedback to the employee and give the employee discounts for making healthier decisions. But I mean, as you can probably imagine, there's some room for abuse there. And so how might some of these issues start to affect you? Because I'm guessing most of you are entrepreneurs, managers, IT managers, IT people. You're not call center workers. You're not Uber car drivers or grocery store workers or that sort of thing. So I mentioned earlier Clout and Tracker, which is the company that said that I was really influential about big data. There's some other companies like Cred and Little Bird. But I'm going to focus on Clout for right now because they're one of the best known. And they do something that's really interesting. If you have a Twitter account, how many of you have Twitter accounts? Okay, it looks like about half of you. So all of you who have Twitter accounts have a Clout profile unless you've specifically gone to clout.com and opted out. So it's publicly accessible, so anyone can go and find out what subjects you are, according to Clout, influential on. So now if you're thinking about going to a new job at some point, and your employer then could pull up Clout and look and see, is this person actually influential about this industry or within their profession? So if you work in telecommunications, somebody might be able to pull up and see, is this person influential on the subject of telecommunications? If you work in IT, they can pull it up and look and see, are they actually influential about any particular IT-related topic? And if you're not, that could seriously affect your employability if this sort of thing takes off. Now, in Tracker's defense and Clout's defense, I'll point out that this is not their intended use. They're meant for marketers who want to find influencers to tweet about their products and that sort of thing. They're not trying to tell employers who's knowledgeable, who's competent in a particular field. But as my presence here today indicates, there are people out there starting to use these things in different ways, and there are some. And even if these companies don't promote their tools to be used in this way, other companies could come down the pipe later who do this sort of thing. But now we'll have to ask some questions about how well any of this would actually work for anybody. So I've already mentioned that I think that I benefited from an anomaly in Tracker's ranking systems. But how many people could potentially be left behind because of something like that? For example, if you're not even on Twitter, if you're not on Facebook, then you're not going to have any sort of profile there. Or if you use Twitter, but you don't actually tweet about work, then you're not going to appear to be influential about any sort of work topic. So I find this really interesting in that we have thought a lot as people, as employees, over the past few years about what not to put online. We don't want to put embarrassing drunken photos online. We don't want to make inappropriate, unprofessional comments online because an employer might come along and see that. We haven't really thought a whole lot about what we do want to put online to project a particular image to employers. And especially we haven't thought about what we would want to put online to impress an algorithm. Also, to go back to some of the other stuff I talked about before with the monitoring of call center workers, the monitoring of drivers, the monitoring of any of those types of employees. What effect does that sort of constant monitoring have on somebody? And I would argue that it could be pretty negative. So there was a group of psychologists from the University of Rochester, through their research, identified the three most important factors for employee motivation. One is they call relatedness, and I think we could refer to that as meaningfulness. So having a job that they feel has an impact on the world, that's important in the world, or relevant. And so there's not necessarily a whole lot you can do about that as a manager or as an employee. So I'm going to not talk about that. The next issue, though, is autonomy, which is how self-directed your job is. So the more autonomy you give an employee, theoretically, the more motivated he or she will be. And that's where I think that a lot of this monitoring stuff can be a real detriment to employee motivation. If they think Big Brother is watching them in every way, watching their personal lives in terms of what they're eating, their personal lives about what they're posting to Facebook, as well as how many bathroom breaks they take, how long it takes them to enter data into a computer, and so on and so forth, it's going to have an effect on employee morale at some point. But there's another interesting motivator called mastery. It turns out people really like to get better at doing their jobs. Being able to improve a skill is actually a really good motivator for people. So what are some ways then that we could actually take this data monitoring and turn it from a morale-killing, motivation-killing, Big Brother surveillance program into something that can be more beneficial to the employee or to ourselves? So a few slides back, I showed you a guy with a sign that said, "We'll tweet for food." That was Chris Dancy, who's my co-host on Mindful Cyborgs, and he's possibly one of the most quantified people in the world. He got really into something called the quantified self movement, and he wears a bunch of different sensors that track his movements throughout the day, They track his skin temperature, his heart rate. He also does some other interesting things where he takes screenshots of what he's working on throughout the day and automatically logs those to a Google Calendar, so that if you were to ask him, Chris, what were you working on at work 6 months ago? He could pull up to the date a set of screenshots about what he was actually doing. He can pull up data about what his heart rate was like that day, so he can kind of get an idea of, was he feeling stressed out? Was he feeling angry, or was he relaxed that day? He logs what music he listens to all day, so he can also look back to see whether that was affecting his mood, whether that was affecting his productivity. And he told me, if you can measure it, someone will, and that someone should be you. If clout is going to measure you, you should at least try to measure yourself. So that's something else he does, that he logs every single tweet he does. All his social media interactions get saved using different tools, so he can tell how people are reacting. And he says that he tries to see himself the way an algorithm would see him, for example, clout. So he thinks a lot about what he puts on a social network, not just, again, because he doesn't want to post something embarrassing, but because he doesn't want to ever post anything that's irrelevant to his readers. He wants to constantly provide really high quality content that people are actually going to care about and not waste people's time and attention. So, it's actually worked out really well for him. He started doing this stuff about 3 years ago when he got laid off from a IT help desk job. And now he is the director of the office of the CTO of BMC Software. And he's helping them decide the future of their IT software lines. So he's become very influential. And he's gotten press coverage from Bloomberg TV, the Financial Times, and I interviewed him for Wired, and I'm now working with him on this podcast. But how might you apply that idea then to all of your employees? Because Chris does this stuff, that has nothing to do with his work at BMC directly. He does that all on his own, basically his own decision to become more masterful of his profession, of his skills. These are some things that I personally use to self-surveil. I use rescue time, which lets me record everything I do on my computer all day, how much time I spend in different applications, how much time I spend on different websites, so that I can make sure I'm spending enough time writing every day and not too much time goofing off on Facebook or Tumblr. And I also use ThinkUp, which you can kind of think of as like an open source clone of Clout that you can use yourself, that lets you know how people have been responding to your tweets and so forth. We can actually see some of that stuff being applied with Evolve as well. So there's some very interesting possibilities there, that we can actually improve both autonomy and mastery in our work lives by analyzing our own data and our own productivity, instead of having management decide, well, we're going to monitor everything you do. So we could have instead a self-service system where employees, instead of being told, you have to improve at this, can just go in, look at how they're doing, and then decide on their own to improve something. So it's argued that we have a choice at this point. We can either have data Darwinism that kills autonomy, it decreases motivation, and may just be flat out unfair to some employees who are doing a good job but just have somehow been skipped over by an algorithm or been misrepresented by a computer glitch. Or we could have data empowerment. We can improve our mastery of skills, we can increase our autonomy, and we can just become more motivated in general. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions, and I have a headset here if anyone wants to speak Spanish or Catalan to translate your questions. It's probably going to be in proprietary software that's built on top of open source software. Things like Hadoop have gained a huge amount of traction, but they're fairly difficult to use, and so we've been seeing a lot of companies that are trying to simplify that process by building a closed source solution that connects to an open source solution. So I think the future is probably going to be in those sort of blended open source, closed source types of solutions. Well, in terms of worker productivity, some of the companies I mentioned earlier, like Evolve and Sociometric Solutions, these first three here on the list specifically, they're mostly focused, I think, on call center workers. They combine a certain amount of qualitative information in the form of surveys with quantitative information that they collect from location trackers, from time spent on calls, and that sort of thing. And those are, as far as I know, completely proprietary solutions that these services offer. Trying to combine qualitative and quantitative information will, as far as I know, generally involve a certain amount of human interpretive effort, and isn't necessarily something that can work with the sort of automated analysis that we usually think of as being part of big data. I've only touched on it very minimally in pointing out that some of the, some of these algorithms are potentially unfair to some workers, and so that's an ethical issue. I think that there's a big ethical issue as well in terms of companies are trying to collect about workers' private lives of whether they eat healthily or not. I think that's definitely an ethical question, and then. The NSA thing is obviously a huge ethical issue for the companies involved with that. I sort of feel like the ethics of this stuff is a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, just in that that's a huge rabbit hole to go down, and I kind of wanted to make more of a practical case about why you shouldn't do this stuff. But obviously, ethically, you shouldn't spy on people. That's, that's a good practice. So I think the legislative issue is very important, and that we should all be talking about it and talking to our political leaders about it. But at the same time, in the short term, being educated about what information companies can actually collect and what they can do with it is really important. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk a little bit about clout, because they exist completely outside of even Twitter. They're not owned by Twitter, but they collect data from Twitter, from public sources mostly, and can create these interesting profiles of you. And that's just, to my mind, the beginning of what's going to happen with public social media information. So that we really just need to think about what we're putting out there and how it could be used. Once again, thanks very much for your time and your attention. And feel free to email me any more questions.